Chapter 4 of Allan and the Holy Flower. This recording is in the public domain. Allan and the Holy Flower by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 4 Mavovo and Hans. We arrived safely at Durban at the beginning of March, and took up our quarters at my house on the Berea, where I expected that Brother John would be awaiting us. But no Brother John was to be found. The old lame Griqua, Jack, who looked after the place for me and once had been one of my hunters, said that shortly after I went away in the ship, Dogeetah, as he called him, had taken his tin box and his net and walked off inland, he knew not where, leaving, as he declared, no message or letter behind him. The cases full of butterflies and dried plants were also gone, but these, I found, he had shipped to some port in America, by sailing vessel bound for the United States, which chanced to put in at Durban for food and water. As to what had become of the man himself I could get no clue. He had been seen at Maritzburg and, according to some Kaffirs whom I knew, afterwards on the borders of Zululand, where, so far as I could learn, he vanished into space. This, to say the least of it, was disconcerting, and a question arose as to what was to be done. Brother John was to have been our guide. He alone knew the Mazitu people. He alone had visited the borders of that mysterious Pongo land. I scarcely felt inclined to attempt to reach that country without his aid. When a fortnight had gone by and still there were no signs of him, Stephen and I held a solemn conference. I pointed out the difficulties and dangers of the situation to him, and suggested that, under the circumstances, it might be wise to give up this wild orchid chase and go elephant hunting instead in a certain part of Zululand, where in those days these animals were still abundant. He was inclined to agree with me, since the prospect of killing elephants had attractions for him. And yet, I said after reflection, it's curious, but I never remember making a successful trip after altering plans at the last moment, that is, unless one was driven to it. "I vote we toss up," said Somers. "It gives Providence a chance. Now then, heads up for the golden slip, and tails for the elephants." He spun a half-crown into the air. It fell and rolled under a great yellow wood chest full of curiosities that I had collected, which it took all our united strength to move. We dragged it aside, and not without some excitement, for a really good deal hung upon the chance, I lit a match and peered into the shadow. There in the dust lay the coin. "What is it?" I asked of Somers, who was stretched on his stomach on the chest. "Head," he answered. "Well, that's settled, so we needn't bother any more." The next fortnight was a busy time for me. As it happened, there was a schooner in the bay of about 100 tons burden which belonged to a Portuguese trader named Delgado, who dealt in goods that he carried to the various East African ports and Madagascar. He was a villainous-looking person, whom I suspected of having dealings with the slave traders, who were very numerous and a great power in those days, if indeed he were not one himself. But as he was going to Kilwa, whence we proposed to start inland, I arranged to make use of him to carry our party and the baggage. The bargain was not altogether easy to strike for two reasons. First, he did not appear to be anxious that we should hunt in the districts at the back of Kilwa, where he assured me there was no game, and secondly, he said that he wanted to sail at once. However, I overcame his objections with an argument he could not resist, namely money, and in the end he agreed to postpone his departure for 14 days. Then I set about collecting our men, of whom I had made up my mind there must not be less than 20. Already I had sent messengers summoning to Durban from Zululand and the upper districts of Natal various hunters who had accompanied me on other expeditions. To the number of a dozen or so they arrived in due course. I have always had the good fortune to be on the best of terms with my Kaffirs, and where I went they were ready to go without asking any questions. The man whom I had selected to be their captain under me was a Zulu of the name of Mavovo. He was a short fellow, past middle age, with an enormous chest. His strength was proverbial. Indeed, it was said that he could throw an ox by the horns, and myself I have seen him hold down the head of a wounded buffalo that had fallen until I could come up and shoot it. When I first knew Mavovo he was a petty chief and witch doctor in Zululand. Like myself, he had fought for the Prince Umbelazi in the great battle of the Tugela, a crime which Cetewayo never forgave him. About a year afterwards he got warning that he had been smelt out as a wizard and was going to be killed. He fled with 2 of his wives and a child. The slayers overtook them before he could reach the Natal border, and stabbed the elder wife and child of the second wife. They were 4 men, and, made mad by the sight, Mavovo turned on them and killed them all. Then, with the remaining wife, cut to pieces as he was, he crept to the river and threw it to Natal. Not long after his wife died also, it was said from grief at the loss of her child. Mavovo did not marry again, perhaps because he was now a man without means, for Cetewayo had taken all his cattle, also he was made ugly by an assegai wound which had cut off his right nostril. Shortly after the death of his second wife he sought me out and told me he was a chief without a kraal and wished to become my hunter. So I took him on, a step which I never had any cause to regret, since although morose and at times given to the practice of uncanny arts, he was a most faithful servant and brave as a lion, or rather as a buffalo, for a lion is not always brave. Another man whom I did not send for, but who came, was an old Hottentot named Hans, with whom I had been more or less mixed up all my life. When I was a boy he was my father's servant in the Cape Colony and my companion in some of those early wars. Also he detailed some very terrible adventures with me, which I have detailed in the history I have written of my first wife, Maria Marias. For instance, he and I were the only persons who escaped from the massacre of Retief and his companions by the Zulu king, Dingaan. In the subsequent campaigns, including the Battle of the Blood River, he fought at my side and ultimately received a good share of captured cattle. After this he retired and set up a native store at a place called Pinetown, about 15 miles out of Durban. Here, I am afraid, he got into bad ways and took to drink more or less, also to gambling. At any rate, he lost most of his property, so much of it indeed that he scarcely knew which way to turn. Thus it happened that one evening, when I went out of the house where I had been making up my accounts, I saw a yellow-faced, white-haired old fellow squatted on the verandah, smoking a pipe made out of a corn cob. "Good day, Baas," he said. "Here I am, Hans." "So I see," I answered rather coldly. "And what are you doing here, Hans? How can I spare you from your drinking and gambling in Pinetown to visit me here, Hans, after I've not seen you for 3 years?" "Baas, the gambling is finished, because I have nothing more to stake, and the drinking is done too, because 1 bottle of Cape Smoke makes me feel quite ill next morning. So now I only take water, and as little of that as I can, water and some tobacco to cover up its taste." "I'm glad to hear it, Hans. If my father the Predikant, who baptized you, were alive now, he would have much to say about your conduct, as indeed I have no doubt he will presently when you have gone into a hole, i.e. a grave. For there in the hole he will be waiting for you, Hans." I know, Baas. I have been thinking of that, and it troubles me. Your reverend father, the Predikant, will be very cross indeed with me when I join him in the place of fires where he sits awaiting me. So I wish to make my peace with him by dying well, and in your service, Baas. I hear that the Baas is going on an expedition. I have come to accompany the Baas." "To accompany me? Why, you are old. You are not worth 5 shillings a month and your scoff (food). You are a shrunken old brandy cask that will not even hold water." Hans grinned right across his ugly face. "Oh, Baas, I am old, but I am clever. All these years I have been gathering wisdom. I am as full of it as a bee's nest is with honey when the summer is done. And, Baas, I can stop those leaks in the cask." "Hans, it is no good. I don't want you. I am going into great danger. I must have those about me whom I can trust." "Well, Baas, who can be better trusted than Hans, who warned you of the attack of the Quabies at Marisfontein, and who so saved the life of—" "Hush!" I said. "I understand. I will not speak the name. It is holy not to be mentioned. It is the name of one who stands with the white angels before God not to be mentioned by poor drunken Hans. Still, who stood at your side in that great fight? Ah! it makes me young again to think of it, when the roof burned, when the door was broken down, when we met the Quabies on the spear, when you held the pistol to the head of the Holy One whose name must not be mentioned, the Great One who knew how to die. Oh, Baas, our lives are twisted up together like the creeper and the tree, and where you go there I must go also. Do not turn me away. I ask no wages, only a bit of food and a handful of tobacco, and the